So this event is more than an all-candidates event. What we wanted to do today is borrow from the Metro Vancouver Alliance Election Accountability Assembly format. And what that is about is that we're asking for something today. We're advocating for something. And today our focus is the CEDAW Convention. Can I just see, who has heard of CEDAW or the CEDAW Convention? Okay, half and half, great. So I just want to give a very brief introduction to what this is. So CEDAW stands for the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. It's a UN treaty that was ratified by Canada in 1981, and federal and provincial governments are responsible for the implementation of women's rights in Canada and BC. And what we're going to talk about today is how we need to hold BC accountable and aim very high, really for the gold standard in terms of our full human rights as women through the CEDAW Convention. So I'm just going to sort of move ahead here. So this is very relevant because every 4 years, Canada is reviewed on our progress under the convention that protects and upholds women's rights. We were reviewed in October, and a number of us went to that review. NGOs and nonprofit feminist organizations and others submitted shadow reporting to the United Nations. The committee reads these reports, and then a month later, the committee issues concluding observations. And this year, well, just 2016, we were issued very strong concluding observations that we can now use to lobby federally and provincially for what we need to really move the dial forward. So the BC CEDAW group, which is a coalition of organizations and others, are advocating, sort of started a campaign around the implementation of CEDAW called Step Up for Women Canada and Step Up for Women BC. And this campaign advocates to implement the concluding observations of the committee. This is the campaign logo, Step Up for Women's Equality. You'll see it if you go on Twitter, if you hashtag Step Up for Women BC. And we also issued a letter to our premier and the leader of the official opposition, and all of these other organizations joined the BC CEDAW group in endorsing this ask around implementing the CEDAW Convention, including addressing that federally. There are organizations lobbying federally, and then organizations working provincially on what we can accomplish here. So I suppose the point I'd like to make next, this is the United Nations here. It's a big stony building with lots of flags. But I just want to make a point. I know this isn't the best picture about how we can use the UN. This is Sheila Day and Sharon McIver and Pam Palmater and Francine Joe from the NWAC. But I wanted to talk about Sheila and Sharon. They were instrumental many, many years ago in asking the UN to send a convoy, an investigative convoy out to Canada to investigate missing and murdered Indigenous women. They made that happen, and that created that began to create the political will that we needed all of these many years to get to where we are now on missing and murdered Indigenous women. So I just wanted to point out how effective and how important it is to use the UN and our obligations there for furthering women's rights. And finally, I just wanted to mention this is a mural at the entrance to the Library of the United Nations, and it just reminds me of the 175 other countries that have ratified the treaty and how we can really think of the solidarity we have with women all over the world who are trying to work on women's rights in their various countries. Thank you very much. Okay, now we will move into our speakers who will dig into the meat of the concluding observations and really talk about what BC is responsible for, because BC is responsible, provinces are responsible for things like wages, housing, welfare rates, childcare, and the needs of women with disabilities, detention of women with mental health issues, abortion, harm reduction strategies, and more. Those are areas of provincial jurisdiction, and they really matter. So without further ado, we're going to move into our speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vivica. Next, we will hear from my Eaglespeaker, a single mother of 4 children, ages 4 to 11, on the lived impact of precarious work, wages, childcare, and housing.
Thank you, Debbie. My name is Mai. I've been asked to share my experiences as a single parent on behalf of Single Mothers Alliance because I am that single mother of 4 who has never been able to access subsidized housing. I have been on the BC housing list since my first child was born. He is now 11. Affordable housing for many is just not accessible. Here is my story. In 2012, Brandon, the father of my children, passed away suddenly and tragically. Distraught, alone, and grief-stricken, I could not stand the idea of staying in the place we shared, the place where he had died. Neither could I afford it. I was completely overwhelmed. I planned my first funeral that week, and I moved into a transition house with my children. It was a decent 3-bedroom place, and I was really grateful. I began reapplying for subsidized housing all over again. I was there for 6 months and still had not located housing when I was evicted. My mother had brought my brother a block away from my place, breaching the security protocol of the transition house. Homeless again, I moved in with my mother, adding 5 more people to the apartment she shared with my 4 younger sisters. So there were 10 of us there altogether. This became unbearable at times. So my children and I moved back and forth between shelters and my mom's place for the next 2 months. I finally secured market rental housing, but at a cost of $2,000 a month for a 3-bedroom. I could not afford it, but I could not stand to be homeless with Christmas coming. Let me give you a window into my reality. I was born into a family on income assistance. I have 7 siblings. I grew up in what people refer to as the projects, and I had my first child at 17. Not ideal. What I want now is a better life for my children. This, though, has been a struggle. I have completed a year's worth of college because I recognized that my only ticket out of poverty is through education. My band, however, has rescinded their offer for funding for this, and with the overwhelming expensive housing, I have not been able to undertake this further on my own. I'm currently on disability and I work casual as a mental health support worker. Even with that income, it is hard to make ends meet and harder still to move forward. Thankfully, the only thing I do have is childcare, but I do not have childcare for the precarious shift work I often do. Through my work, I am not yet eligible for benefits. My children are not status, and I do not receive death benefits, nor do I have family that can help with childcare or finances. I am on my own. In the past 4 years, I moved 7 times. Not only is this incredibly disruptive and stressful to be constantly packing and unpacking while managing 4 children, it makes it almost impossible to move forward economically with this kind of housing instability and expense. Most recently, we were renting a 2-bedroom house and were evicted because the tenants downstairs complained that my children were too noisy. Today, we move yet again. I was really excited when I located this house, a 4-bedroom with a huge yard for my kids to play in. Since paying my damage deposit, I have learned that there is a rat infestation in the ground floor suite of the house. The tenants there explained to me that the stove had been broken by the rats and can't be used because it is full of rat urine and feces. And the place had been flooded twice because the rats have chewed through the plumbing. The landlord has not returned my calls regarding these concerns, and I moved in today. And I will be paying $2,500 a month to live there. I am not optimistic. I recently seen a housing worker who was not shocked at all by my housing difficulties I am experiencing. She confided to me that in that housing society, they only had 2 4-bedroom units, and one was on its way to becoming market rental housing at $2,500 a month. Other 4-bedroom units had been divided into 2-bedroom units because they were more marketable. She suggested I moved to Surrey. I don't know if my housing search will ever be over, What I do know is that with stable housing and affordable childcare, I would have an opportunity to move myself and my family forward. I pray for policies that would make this possible. Policies that would allow every parent to achieve their full potential for the betterment of their family. Today is my moving day, and in spite of that, I have made a point of being here to share my struggle with you in hopes that change can happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Mai. Our next speaker is Kendra. She's legal director of West Coast Leaf on the issues Mai has addressed through her lived experience. Kendra recently represented BC at the UN CEDAW Review of Canada, addressing women's rights to childcare and lack of legal aid in BC. Welcome, Kendra.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much, Mai, for sharing your story. I think that's a really challenging thing to do, and I really appreciate it. As Debbie said, I work at West Coast Leaf. West Coast Leaf is the first and only organization in BC dedicated to promoting women's equality through the law and through our legal systems. And we work to make sure that laws and policies in BC support the full participation of and dignity of women in the province. We issue annual report cards focused on the province's progress with respect to its obligations under the CEDAW Convention that Vivica explained. And we also make submissions when the UN is reviewing Canada under its international human rights treaties, including the CEDAW Convention. It's from this context of our work that I can tell you that sadly, women all over BC regularly have experiences like the one that Mai just described. The reality is that her experience is just a living mirror of significant problems with our provincial laws and policies. And those problems are largely because the provincial government has failed to make significant progress in many areas of women's human rights that are protected under the CEDAW Convention. The reality is that internationally, Canada ranks poorly in terms of women's equality measures, and within Canada, BC often lags far behind other provinces in these measures. This provincial inaction and lack of commitment to the obligations under the CEDAW Convention mean that many women in BC simply do not have equal opportunity to live their rights with dignity, security, and safety. And in a few minutes' time, I'm going to do my best to go over a little bit of the current state of things in BC for women in the areas of employment, childcare, poverty, and housing. In terms of employment, the average earnings of women in BC are well below the average earnings of women across Canada. And the gendered pay gap, the gap between earnings of male workers and female workers, while Canada ranks quite poorly internationally, BC's pay gap is significantly bigger than other provinces. That gap grows and average wages decrease further for Indigenous women, racialized women, and women with disabilities. And despite the fact that the majority of minimum wage earners in BC are women, our current minimum wage rates do not allow a worker who is working full-time for a full year, which most minimum wage workers do not have access to. A full-time, full-year worker's earnings will be still below the poverty line. BC's current childcare crisis has serious consequences for women's equality in the province and is deeply intertwined with their economic security and their financial independence. Mothers' workforce participation rates in BC are lower than the national average. Access to regulated childcare spaces and the cost of spaces, access is lower than the national average and the cost of spaces is higher than the national average. And the reality for many women is that there are just simply not enough high-quality safe spaces for their children. And if they are able to access one of those spaces, they're prohibitively expensive. Further, those safe spaces typically do not provide meaningful access for women that work casually, who don't know their schedules in advance, or who work shift work. Many women are forced to put their children in patchwork childcare situations. That includes, we hear from women who have their children staying with neighbors, have childcare trades with other single mothers, who have older siblings, often who may not be of an age where they should be caring for children, providing childcare for their kids. These situations are chaotic, they're stressful, and at times they're unsafe. Other women, particularly single mothers, simply cannot find or afford the childcare they need that would allow them to work. The cost is so high that they know that based on their earning potential, they just will not be able to earn enough from employment to be able to pay for the cost of childcare they need to go to work every day, in addition to their housing costs and other basic necessities. These women are typically forced to either become financially dependent on another person, often a romantic partner, or on the social assistance system in order to survive. Financial dependence on a partner is deeply problematic because we know that that increases the risk of relationship violence, and it makes it harder for women to leave when they experience violence. And for the women who are forced to rely on social assistance, we know that they get trapped in a cycle of deep poverty because current income and disability assistance rates are so low that these families simply cannot meet their basic needs in terms of housing and food to survive. They're forced to spend their time going to food banks, cobbling together resources to exist, and not in terms of trying to get themselves off of assistance. We know all this is true because stats tell us this. We know that single parent, particularly single mother-led families in BC have higher rates of food insecurity, and again, higher than the Canadian average. And we also know that BC consistently has poverty rates that are higher than the Canadian average, and particularly rates for single women and single women caring for children are shocking. Currently, for children living in single parent families, half of those children live in poverty in BC. Despite all of this, BC remains the only province without a comprehensive poverty reduction strategy. Finally, in terms of housing, again, BC fares quite poorly. We have incredibly low vacancy rates in our urban areas, which makes it really hard to find housing. We have skyrocketing rents, and we have inadequate social housing stock, particularly for families that are larger like MI's, because there just simply are not units available for them. Unfortunately, stories like we just heard of sitting on a wait list for subsidized housing for multiple years on end is all too common. It's particularly important because housing security is experienced differently for women than it's experienced by men. Much of our housing policy is geared towards addressing street homelessness, which is incredibly important, but the reality is women don't typically show up in the street homeless population. That's because being homeless on the street or even in emergency shelters is simply not safe for women, and women with children are at risk of child apprehension if they're in those situations. Women typically, instead, are much more likely to stay in unsafe and insecure housing or enter into relationships that they wouldn't otherwise be in order to get a roof over their heads and a roof over the heads of their children. To make things worse, women who are forced into the private rental market in BC are really at risk because BC has quite weak tenancy laws compared to other provinces. We have inadequate rent controls, and we also have really inadequate enforcement mechanisms. So stories like MI's, while we have legal protections that are supposed to ensure access to housing that meets basic safety standards, the reality is in BC, it's nearly impossible to enforce those standards as a tenant. So what that means is that families like MI's face an uphill battle to ensure that their home is safe, and they face very few options if they decide to look elsewhere for housing. Given all of these problems, what's the solution? Well, all the issues I just highlighted and that Mai highlighted in her story are areas that the provincial government can take action in to make real change to improve the lives of women. In November, the CDOC committee expressed concerns about Canada and BC's compliance in these particular areas, and they also provided a roadmap for how to fix them. They issued recommendations on the international stage mandating the government to fix and comply with their obligations under the treaty. They included things like taking measures to reduce the gendered wage gap, increasing minimum wage to a livable wage, adopting a rights-based childcare framework that ensures access to safe and affordable childcare, ensuring that social assistance rates can ensure an adequate standard of living for people on them, intensifying efforts to ensure affordable housing options with a priority focus on low-income women. And finally, they also suggested designing policies to address the specific needs of particular groups of marginalized women, including Indigenous women, racialized women, women with precarious immigration status, and women with disabilities. The action that we need to take in BC to fix these problems is not a mystery. We know what the answers are. It's simply a matter of committing to implement them. And to be very clear, all levels of government in Canada have an obligation under the CDOC Convention to take action in these areas. It's not something that can be left to the federal government alone, and it's certainly not something that can be left to charities to try to fill the gap or to private responses. The provincial government's failure to meet the obligations under the CEDAW Convention leads to a series of complex, interconnected, and incredibly serious consequences in the everyday lives of women. And now is the time for us to step up and for our elected officials to step up to commit to change. Thank you.
Okay, so how will your party fulfill the CEDAW Convention and realize women's full human rights in BC by addressing issues impacting women's labor market, precarious work trends, low wages, childcare, poverty, and welfare, plus affordable housing and large family stock?
Our next speaker is Debbie Henry, a single mother of 2 girls, ages 8 and 10, and an activist and advocate for women's and children's rights in BC. She will address violence against Indigenous women, domestic violence, legal aid, and the related poverty and mental and physical health impacts of violence on women.
Thank you, Camilla. My name is Debbie Henry. I am Coast Salish from Cowichan Tribes, Vancouver Island. I'm the youngest child of 7 to my late parents, Modeste and Virginia Henry, and I am a single mother of 2 beautiful daughters, aged 10 and 8. I grew up in a loving, caring home that is rich in culture, ceremony, traditional language, teachings, but also I grew up in an abusive home, substance, physical, sexual, mental, emotional. And not many people get to the root of the problem. For a lot and many First Nations in all of Canada, I want to share a snapshot of my mom's story. My mother, at age 7 or 8, was put in residential school. She was living with her grandmother on Bonaparte Reserve, whom never spoke a word of English. Then one day, the Indian agent drove up to my great-grandmother's home and took my mother, locked her in the back seat of his car, and drove away. With my late mother said, this is what she remembers, her grandma running after the car, crying and screaming, and speaking their traditional language for my mom. These Indian agents knew what was best for this little Indian girl. The priests, the nuns knew what was best for all these Indians by beating, raping, torturing, physical abuse. For example, every time they spoke their traditional language, they got beaten or whipped. They cut off their long, beautiful hair. They dressed them in Western clothes. My late mother survived the Kamloops residential school until she married my father at age 17. So yes, I'm very familiar with violence. My late mother is the strongest woman I know. There were many levels of abuse at residential school, and this has affected my grandparents, my parents, my siblings, and myself, and all First Nations people throughout Canada. I am a second-generation survivor, but I also attended day school. Domestic violence has impacted my life as a child and as an adult. I experienced it and survived it. I did not know what postpartum depression was until I had my first child. I had a health nurse, home support, Aboriginal support worker, a counselor, that they would all come visit my home. And yet I still crashed. I cried out to my family, but no one came. So I found myself dealing with criminal court and family court, and my 3-month-old baby was apprehended by MCFD from her father. This takes me into legal aid. So I had an appointment with a lawyer for 2 hours. I shared my story, and he said he was tied up. All he could tell me was my ex had 7 convictions and couldn't tell me anything else. So I dealt with criminal court without a lawyer. I went and found who was Crown Counsel, and I shared my story with him. My baby's 3 months old, needed her mother because she was breastfeeding. I quickly said and admitted I made a mistake, but I learned quick. So I shared my situation with him, and the Crown Counsel, he understood. So the next day I went and I appeared in a suit and was ready for court, and he asked me what I was doing there. And I said, well, my name's still on the list of all these hundreds of criminals. And we walked into a courtroom, and he told the judge, they have no business with me, and it was dropped. So off to family court I went and gave the lawyer the news. And I got my baby back in 5 days. And I remember, and my Aboriginal support worker looked at me. She said, what makes you special? Because no one gets their baby back in 5 days if you know the system. And that was with my first daughter. And with my second daughter, once again, I found myself in family court. So I'm familiar with the old family law and the new. I walked into the courtroom and the judge looked at me and said, you're wasting my time, where's your lawyer? And I wasn't eligible for legal aid. So once again, I stood there representing myself. And I just spoke and tried to speak the best I could without feeling intimidated. And he dismissed me right away. So then that mother bear came out, and all I said was, I'm the best advocate for my 5-year-old daughter, and I won. The judge said, good luck. So I'm very familiar with the family court and legal aid, well, the lack thereof. During all this chaos of these bad relationships, I found myself at the front door of a safe house and lived in the shelter for 1 month until I got accepted into second stage housing. And I lived there to the maximum time allowed, which is 18 months. And now I'm in affordable housing. But it wasn't until I dealt with crisis. Like, what is wrong with our system? We have to be in a crisis situation. Single moms have to be in vulnerable crisis situations to get the supports. And that's the only way I gained childcare. So I'm very familiar with the system. So the history of residential school affected my health, my life, my well-being. I've dealt with trauma, I've dealt with violence, postpartum depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, substance abuse as a result. And currently living in poverty and living on income assistance. And that's not just being First Nations or uneducated. I am university educated. I had a federal job and I earned $80,000 a year. But today, I am a single mom. I live in poverty. Yes, I do struggle, and this is temporary. And right now, I challenge you, your party, your platform, just do not let history repeat itself, and let all Canadians learn the after effects of residential school, and give support to all the single mothers. Thank you.
Next up, to further discuss the issues impacting Debbie in her life, is France Emmanuel, Executive Director of Vancouver's Women's Health Collective, who works in the downtown east side on the front lines of women's health.
Thank you, Camilla. Thank you, everybody, for being here. As Camilla said, my name is France Emmanuel. I work with the Vancouver Women's Health Collective, an organization that's been around for approximately 45 years and started because women didn't want men to tell them what to do with their bodies and how to manage their health. The organization, of course, has changed a lot, and one of the things that we're primarily interested in is health equity, and that means providing access to health for all women and adequate access to health. I think that Debbie's story is very telling, but I would also like to remind everybody here that we can't just say, oh, it's because she's Indigenous that she has all this trauma. A lot of women will go through trauma, and yes, some women will have additional layers or additional circumstances that we have to take into consideration and seriously address. But I think that we also have to think about violence against women or gendered violence in a global perspective, in the sense that it has an impact on a lot of things. And one of the things it has an impact on is our health, but it also has an economic impact. So if we look at things like different studies that were done in Canada, and if we look at the impact of spousal violence, numbers are pretty much the same between men and women, and this comes from sort of an understanding that both men and women can perpetrate or be victims of spousal violence. However, the impact is generally more severe for women. Findings from a 2009 General Social Survey indicate that females continue to report more serious forms of spousal violence than males, and victims also include additional gender barriers when it comes especially to their ability to seek help and seek justice and support. One of the things that researchers have also pointed out is that sometimes you'll see that studies will say that men and women are equally victims of violence, but the one difference is when you dig a little bit deeper and you look at what is called the intimate terrorism and common couple violence. Intimate terrorism is characterized by one spouse using severe violence to gain power, control, and domination over the other spouse, while common couple violence is characterized by mostly minor violence triggered by conflict issues common to many relationships. And empirical evidence finds that 87% of intimate terrorism is perpetrated by men, and that 55% of common couple violence is perpetrated by women. So there's a huge difference in there when you start looking at really what violence also includes, and violence also includes a notion of control over a person and over their freedom and their own decisions. Of course, a lot of these studies only look at numbers that come from police reports or from self-reported incidents, so there's a lot that we do not know. Research on the cost of violence cannot take into account non-reported cases, and it doesn't usually take into consideration the long-term effects on victims or on their children. However, there is an increased understanding that spousal violence or intimate partner violence is being understood as an economic issue, and that it has a financial cost. It's estimated over $7 billion per year in Canada alone. And different estimates have been done over time, and they don't necessarily take into consideration exactly the same thing. But when we're talking about health-related economic costs of violence against women, it usually includes medical cost, work loss, transition homes, access to justice, legal aid, social services, and education, and labor and employment. In BC alone, the numbers were estimated and readjusted for 2009 to 500 million. If we look at numbers per person, the annual estimated cost of selected public and private sector expenditures attributed to violence against women are around $13,000 per woman. That's a lot of money. I guess that we could rearrange how we spend that money a little bit better. Another impact is for Canadian employers, and the impact there is estimated that employers lose $77.9 million annually as a result of intimate partner violence. And this is loss of productivity, absence, lateness, distraction, hiring additional people, training additional people, et cetera, plus all the stress that is encountered by workers, co-workers, by the victims themselves, and also by perpetrators who are less productive because they're focused on something else. So evidence suggests that compared to non-victims, more women with a history of intimate partner violence report losing or having to quit their jobs as a direct result of intimate partner violence. And they also, wrong direction of the arrow. They also experience greater job instability for years to come. And this, of course, has an impact on their economic ability to rebuild their lives, to have to face the courts if they need to support their children, because women don't necessarily get the payment from their spouse when they finally get to that point of having it recognized. As Kendra was pointing out, there are also significant numbers. Women are the principal users of family legal law aid and civil legal aid. And of course, you can see where we're starting on a slippery slope here. Because women disproportionately experience poverty and economic hardship, they need accessible legal services to enforce their rights. So funding for poverty legal law aid has largely been eliminated in BC over the past few years. And this results in an access to justice crisis in the province. Between 2001 and 2015, the number of family law cases approved for legal aid in BC dropped from around 15,500 to 3,500. Only 32% of the women who received a referral to legal aid lawyer on any matter were women, and fewer than half of persons who applied for family legal aid received a referral to a legal aid lawyer. So this means a 21% drop in funding for legal aid in the past 20 years and 55% drop in the qualified requests. So this is quite significant. And when you think about it, the eligibility is also so restrictive that you have to earn less than a single mom on minimum salary, and you have to liquidate your assets, which means that if you have RSPs, you can't really, you have to liquidate those if you want to have access to legal aid. So basically, not very many women can have access to legal aid, and that is a problem. According to the BC Poverty Reduction Coalition, BC has had the highest poverty rate in Canada for the last 13 years. And as Kendra also mentioned, is the only province without a poverty reduction plan, despite having a nominal GDP growth that has averaged 4.5% in the past decade. Women's poverty rates are higher than men's in British Columbia. And in BC, 63% of minimum wage workers are women. Families relying, again, I'll get to that in just a second. Families relying on social assistance in BC are forced to choose between secure housing, food, and other basic necessities. I'll conclude with a quote from the Missing Women's Commission Inquiry Report from 2012 that noted that eradicating the problem of violence against women involves addressing the root cause of marginalization, notably sexism, racism, and the ongoing pervasive effects of colonization of Aboriginal peoples, all of which contribute to the poverty and insecurity in which many women live.
I pose a question to the candidates. How will your party fulfill the CEDAW Convention and realize women's full human rights in BC by addressing violence against women and Indigenous women specifically, including domestic violence, lack of legal aid, and long-term impact of violence on women's mental and physical health?
Okay, great. Now it's time for the candidates to come up, and we have our 3 names in the candidate bag to try and decide who will go first, because we didn't want to choose for everyone. So our first candidate is Melanie Mark.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's indeed a pleasure to be here. My name is Melanie Mark. My Niska name's Lahaik Wiskak. I'd like to acknowledge that we're gathering on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations people. There were a lot of questions posed to us before we came to this event, big policy issues, lots of discussion on the floor, so it was really great to hear everyone's remarks about what matters to you. It's okay. Issues of the heart, matters that you want us to fight for to change your lives, to improve your lives. So I just wanted to thank you all for being here and for your participation. I know that there are other places that you could be. I want to just start by sharing a little bit about who I am. I think it will help inform why I'm running to be a candidate in the provincial election. I'm currently the MLA for Vancouver Mount Pleasant. I was born and raised in East Vancouver. My mom's here. When we talk about Single Mothers Alliance, I wasn't a part of a Single Mothers Alliance, but I was raised by a single mother with 6 siblings. I grew up in the projects of East Vancouver, so I know full well what social housing looks like. I know when Maya was talking about the trauma of moving, I've moved 30 times in my life. I spent the better part of my childhood surviving from violence and every form of violence. My mom had struggles with addiction issues, and in her absence, I stepped in to be the parent to take care of the siblings in my house. So my life was very unstable and very traumatic, so I really appreciate all the remarks from the floor earlier today about speaking from the heart. Those are the things that motivate me. I don't think it's a child's birthright to have to fight for your rights. I don't think it's your birthright to fight for your safety. I don't think it's your birthright to fight for the protection of violence. When I talk about the impacts that I experienced, it was before the age of 10, so I never got to see life without trauma. My daughter's here. My daughter, Michaela's here, she's 6. I have a 10-year-old daughter. They motivate me. They fuel me. You were talking about being a mother bear. Someone was saying earlier on the floor, we need someone who's going to fight. You know, I have no problem fighting. I've been fighting my whole life. I have no fear. What I do have is an impatience, an intolerance. These issues we've been fighting for a long time. I'd mentioned that I'm Indigenous. Try being Indigenous and reading about the systemic failures to our people time and time and time again. 3 of my grandparents went to residential school, Brandon, Elk Lake, St. Michael's on Vancouver Island. My grandpa didn't go to residential school because he was hidden in the bushes from Indian agents. That's the experience of Indigenous people. So it meant a lot when I got elected last year. I'm the 102nd woman to ever serve in the BC legislature, and I'm the first Indigenous woman to ever serve in the BC legislature. Thank you. And I'm proud of that because, you know, think about our resilience, that we're still standing. There's a lot of talk about Indigenous people and what we suffer. But try being one of those women where, you know, I have to do everything to protect my daughters from being a victim of crime like I have in my childhood. That's what I want as a political representative. That's what I'm fighting for, to stand in the legislature for people that don't have a voice. And I've been that voice. I've taken on Christy Clark in the legislature when she talks about being a voice for women. Show me. You know, 16 years in power, gouging the services that protect women, safe housing, women that have represented themselves in the court because they don't have legal representation. What are we talking about when we talk about housing? You can't be safe, you can't go to school, you can't get a job, you can't keep your kids unless you have a roof over your head. So we know that housing is a right. Our government is committed to making those changes, to making people's lives better. I didn't sign up because I need a job. I've had lots of jobs. I helped create the policing center after Frank Paul, an Indigenous man, was left in the alley for dead. I've taken on and tackled criminal justice issues. I spent the last 8 years with Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond advocating for the most vulnerable children in this province. Imagine what I saw behind the curtains of how systemic failures for the Ministry for Children and Family, removing children because their parents are poor, removing children because their mom doesn't have a house, removing children not because mom doesn't want to go to treatment, but because there is no treatment. That those services have been gouged over and over and over again. And we can't forget, because I am here to represent the NDP as a party, we have to remember our sisters up north that are hitchhiking on the Highway of Tears. They don't have transportation. And that the government, we had to beg to come to the table to do something to get basic services in place to reduce people's vulnerability to violence. So not only 8 years working at the representative's office, I went across the country back when I was 25 advocating for sexually exploited children and youth. That medium is just going online. Sexual violence is in our hands everywhere. So we need to have stronger public policies to protect our women and girls. I can tell you more about what I want to fight for, but I acknowledge that there are some questions about addressing affordable housing. Our NDP party are committed to building affordable housing. Building affordable housing. We plan on having a housing affordability fund that will tax speculation so we can build new units, more affordable units throughout the province. Closing the loophole for people that don't get rent evicted. You were talking about moving and being on a wait list. There's not even a tracking of the wait list anymore with BC Housing. It's a lottery for people to feel like they get in or out of the system. So we acknowledge that we don't want people feeling like they're going to win the lottery. Same with childcare. It was mentioned that people are struggling with childcare, the affordability of childcare. If you can afford $2,200 to pay for childcare. I have 2 children. Someone was mentioning earlier about doing the hustle. I know the hustle. And it's not sustainable. The quality of life, the stress, especially on single mothers, to have to worry about who they're going to leave their kids with so that they can get to work because their child's sick. I get those issues, and our party gets those issues, but we want to make life better. I'm running to make people's lives better, to advocate for change. I have a lot of experience advocating. I'd mentioned 20 years of experience advocating, working in the nonprofits, pleading, coming up with recommendations. There's a roadmap, right? There's a roadmap, and thank you for the speakers that spoke about the statistics in our province. I don't need to bore you with statistics, but I can tell you that the government has been in power for 16 years and they've run a social deficit. They brag about running a balanced budget and everyone's doing great, but with all due respect, I'd like to see some of the leaders come to the downtown east side and see what the conditions are like. Go into the SRO, places that my mom used to live. Have the housing minister come down and see what those conditions are like. So we need to do things like improve the Residential Tenancy Act. That's one way to protect people, vulnerable people that are dealing with landlords that are going to take advantage in this housing crisis. May I get a time check, please? I just don't want to go over. 2 minutes. So childcare I spoke of, we're committed to a $10 a day childcare plan. The point of that is to have a plan that's accessible for everyone, not this lottery system, and not a system of have and have nots. Under this government, we see a lot of, you're welcome to have it if you have the money. We want a system in place that is going to reduce the inequality for women and parents in this family, parents that are ships in the night, to make their lives better. Poverty and welfare for women, we've called on a poverty reduction strategy, a comprehensive plan, 6 times in the legislature to no avail. Truth be told, the BC Liberals are not interested in a poverty reduction strategy, and we're the only province in this country that doesn't have a plan. There's a saying, fail to plan, plan to fail. We need a plan that's going to reduce that inequality. We're committed to increasing minimum wage to $15 an hour. We're committed to increasing affordable housing and childcare. Those things combined are going to make people's lives better. Employment, my mom talked about how, she wasn't paid equal pay back in the day. Some things haven't changed. It's 2017. Maybe we need a government that's going to fight for women. And I'm one of those women who, as you can tell, I'm always looking for a fight, especially when it's about rights, justice, and equality. We don't want to be in opposition, though. That's the truth. I need you to know that after 1 year of being elected, it is very difficult to sit on our side of the house and ask the government, please, can you implement these good laws that are going to make people's lives better, just to be ignored. And part of that is making sure, for example, on the issue of domestic violence, that you don't get penalized for missing work because of what happened at home, but there's strong laws in place to protect you, for example, from being fired. Missing murdered Indigenous women and girls. I'm a part of the coalition. I do my best to attend the meetings. Some of these issues I don't need to read about. I've been living these issues. What we need to do is stop having to recreate the wheel. There's a plan. We just need a strong voice in the legislature who's going to bring these. I think what Mai talked about was just bringing hope forward. I want things to be better for my kids. And I want things to be better for my kids' kids, all of your kids. I don't want to keep doing this reactive play on power politics, but really bringing back fairness into the legislature for not just vulnerable people in BC, but all people in BC. So I don't know if I've covered everything, but on the points of CETA and the call to action, we hope that our commitments to reducing inequality will help, but I think the other piece is to restore services for women that are trying to access justice. So thank you very much for your time. Hawa.
Thank you, Melanie Mark. Wow. All right, next candidate we have up for their speech is Tran. Please welcome her to the stage. Tran Naijin. Is that how?
Good afternoon. My name is Tran Nguyen, and I'm the BC Liberal candidate for Vancouver Kingsway. First of all, I would like to thank Viveka Ellis and Single Mothers Alliance BC for organizing this discussion with all of you, wonderful single moms, and other guests. Your presence and participation will bring forth women's voice, equality, and vote in our democratic process. I'm running for MLA because I would like to engage more youths and women to be involved in politics and to empower them their right to vote and to run for office. After arriving in Vancouver, beautiful British Columbia, with my family 35 years ago, I have always appreciated what Canada, British Columbia, and Vancouver Kingsway has given me and my family, and I would like to give back by devoting my life to public service and volunteering. I would like to share a story with you. When she was a very small girl, she and her family finally escaped from her country, which was engaged in the turmoil and oppression of the aftermath of a long war. They escaped, but only after 9 attempts by boat. On 3 separate occasions, that little girl and her family found themselves living in re-education camps. Try to imagine a 5-year-old girl pushing a paddle boat in low-tide muddy water in the rain and dark with water up to her neck. Unfortunately, she failed at the escape attempt and then ended up in still another re-education camp. When the little girl was in the re-education camp, she had to sleep on the grass at night against the rain and mosquitoes and had very little food ration for a month. On the last attempt, they encountered the stormy weather in the South China Sea in a tiny boat for 7 days. They were rescued by a freight boat and lived in a refugee camp on an isolated island in Malaysia for 1 year. When this little girl's family finally arrived in Canada, she was 9 years old, and it was her job to pick berries from 5 in the morning until 10 at night. When she grew up, she ultimately became a Canadian citizenship judge. I was that little girl. As a citizenship judge, I had the privilege and honor to remind new Canadians to embrace their rights and freedoms by voting and running for office, since many of them were not able to practice these rights and freedoms in many other parts in the world. As a single mother of 2 children, aged 11 and 13, I know how hard it is to be able to bring home that paycheck to take care of your loved ones. That is why I'm running for office, to make sure that every resident of Vancouver Kingsway and every British Columbian gets the opportunity to build a life that we want and succeed on their own terms. As a single mother, I have lived experience that will help me advocate for those in similar situations. But I have the humility to know that each person's experience is unique. And I'm honored to have this opportunity to hear from many of you. As a BC Liberal, I believe that the best way to help people reach their full potential is by creating job opportunities in a strong economy. BC is doing well in many ways, but we still need to do better and keep working until everybody has those opportunities. BC is leading the country with over 200,000 new jobs since 2011. I know how challenging it is when you are a single mother trying to do double duty. I have been there, and I said during my CBC interview that it is hard to have a picture perfect because you do not have another person to help out or talk to. Every time I feel weak and want to give up, then I think about my children's future and how proud they will be when they grow up knowing that they were raised by a hard-working single mom. That is why I'm proud of the BC Liberals introducing the Single Parent Employment Initiative, which has already provided new training and job opportunities for 4,500 single moms and dads. For 12 months, single parents will be able to remain on income assistance if they attend a training program. They get coverage of full childcare costs during 1-year training and first year of employment, public transit costs, and from to school, and supplemental health coverage for the first 12 months of employment after living assistance. 92% of participants are female and 8% are male. As part of the early years strategy, we have invested $26.5 million to support the creation of over 4,300 new childcare spaces since 2014. And Balanced Budget 2017 adds another $20 million to create up to 2,000 more new spaces. When I was young and growing up, my family was renting and had to move a dozen of times. We could not afford to buy a house. At one point, 7 of us were living in 2-bedroom basement with water flooding our place up to my waist, and most of my belongings were damaged and destroyed. That is why I'm proud of the BC Liberals for committing additional $920 million this past year to ensure more British Columbians have access to almost 5,300 new units of affordable housing and 24,000 new units of affordable housing since 2001, and provide financial assistance to more than 30,000 BC households to help make renting in the private market more affordable. BC is moving people out of low income at a rate of 60% faster than the national average, with approximately 162,000 people lifted out of poverty between 2006 and 2014. I am passionate about raising awareness of anti-bullying because I have experienced bullying at school and at the workplace. ERASE stands for Expect, Respect, and a Safe Education. ERASE bullying implemented since 2004 is to prevent students from harm, where clear expectations of acceptable behavior are held for all members of the school community, and where there is a sense of connectedness. As a court interpreter for more than 20 years, I have worked with victims and accused persons within the criminal justice system across BC and especially in the Vancouver East Side. With my experience in the justice system, I know it is important to have access to justice for all British Columbians, and that is a priority for our government. The BC Liberals invested over $30 million annually in family justice centers and justice access centers, which support families and individuals to resolve issues and disputes through mediation and collaboration. Domestic violence courts are in place to stop violence in relationships and to keep families safe. How many minutes did you say 2? Okay. To further support this process, government announced that from December 5th, 2016, protection orders made when the respondent is not present in court will be served by contracted process servers at no cost to the applicant. In terms of advocating for Aboriginal women, the BC Liberals recently announced $3 million plan to improve safety along the Highway of Tears, where 18 women, many of whom were Aboriginal, have been killed or gone missing along the highway or nearby routes since 1970s. One of the leading voices in our party on this issue is our candidate, Wanda Woodgood, a respected First Nation leader in Northwest BC, whose family has been personally touched by this issue. I'm inspired to promote political participation and political leadership because I want to instill in my daughter and son that anything is possible if you believe in yourself and working hard for your dream. My refugee and bullying experience taught me to speak up and fight for your rights. I know what it feels like when your voice is not heard and respected. That is why I am committed to fight for equality and fairness for all individuals. I pledge to be the loudest and strongest voice representing you in the BC legislature on May 9th. With your support, I can be proud to elect with your support, you can be proud to elect this single mom who cares and who can address your concerns and issues in government. Thank you.
Thank you, Tran. Next, but not least, we have Elisa Calder. Is that how I pronounce it? Great. Let's welcome her to the stage.
I
appreciate everyone sticking around on a Saturday afternoon. I know after sitting for 2 hours, it must be a little bit hard. If you want to stand up and like shake a little to just wake up, you definitely can. Thanks, Erin, for the introduction, and thank you so much to the Single Mother Alliance and the other event organizers and volunteers for ensuring that women's issues are brought to the forefront in our political discourse and for supporting women throughout our communities. Events like this are great, and it's inspiring that they're coming up now. It's inspiring that they're coming up right before the election, but groups such as theirs are continually supporting women in our communities and doing the real work, not just on this 4-year cycle. So thank you to the other candidates for your frank and open discussion and your passionate debate and plea for women's issues. But most importantly, I want to thank you, women who are gathered here today. It was inspiring and uplifting, really, to be here among such strong and amazing women. I feel really honored to be in your presence and to be given this opportunity to speak. I'm a feminist through and through, and it's really because of women in my life that I'm standing here in front of you today. I grew up in Kelowna, the eldest child of a small business-owning dad and a hobby farming mom. At 18, I went off to Simon Fraser University, and I sort of found my way into the political science department, not unlike, I think, many students who attend SFU. So this really encouraged my interest in politics, and it really began to take off. My first political thoughts, though, really reflected my upbringing. I remember as bright-eyed, bushy-tailed 18-year-old arguing that the government should be run more like a business, because a capitalist society would benefit its citizens most. How all that has changed. So it was really the women that I met at SFU, the friends that I have today, and those friendships that were formed that have altered the course of my life. These women that I met became my friends and confidants. Most importantly, they opened my mind and my imagination. They shared their experiences and stories growing up in different places across BC, across Canada, and their different realities. They were daughters of farmers and teachers and nurses and museum workers and RCMP officers, and I really began to understand that market economies should never become market societies, and that it was the work of many other institutions in our society, including government, that has made Canada and Vancouver one of the best places to live in the world. Living a life with these women have really cemented my feminism and leftism. So my time at SFU expanded my worldview and defined my values, but it's in calling East Vancouver home that I've really connected with the diverse community of this city and the multitude of people who choose to build their lives here and raise their families here. The women of East Vancouver are doers, makers, and providers. They're the backbone of this community, and the city of Vancouver is better because of them. I feel inspired every chance I get to spend time with these women and feel so lucky to call this place home and raise my family here. Especially days like today really help bring that forward for me. So I've come to realize that when given the opportunity, the strength, thoughtfulness, and kindness of women is a powerful and transformative force in our society. It is our tendency to think not only for ourselves, but to consider the consequences for those around us and for the generations to come that has made me a BC Green. The BC Greens are committed to sustainability and intergenerational equality. We are committed to creating a future that balances the needs and rights of all citizens in BC and not pandering to vested interests or chasing the next friendly news bite or election cycle. Our 5 core policy tenets of health, safety, standard of living, environment, and government will ensure all British Columbians live a thriving and prosperous life. We deeply believe that when women are part of the decision-making process, the outcomes are better economic growth, greater successes in business, stronger peace agreements, and more social progress. Having women at the table can make all the difference to the future that we want to build. I'm up here today because when I looked at my young daughter last year, I realized that voting Green on the ballot in this year's election wasn't going to be enough. I knew that I had the capacity to give more and to do more, and for my daughter's sake and for all women's sake in BC, I felt compelled to run. As my best friends always tell me, when you know better, you need to do better. I knew that if I wanted my daughter to have the same opportunities I've had, we needed a change in perspective. I want her to have a world-class education, to live in a safe and diverse community, to have the opportunity to have a career that's fulfilling, to raise a family in this city, and to really experience the astounding natural beauty of this province.
And I really believe that the BC Greens are the party that's going to get us there. So Andrew Weaver and the BC Greens are committed to supporting women and creating a just and fair society for all British Columbians. Our policies promote good health by including access to healthy food, education, stable income, affordable housing, exercise, and recreation. Plus all the benefits of actually having a healthy, natural place to live, and the mental and physical wellness of that should not be underestimated. The levels of poverty and inequality in BC are unacceptably high, as we've heard today, relative to the national average, with one of the highest levels of inequality in Canada and one of the highest levels of child poverty rates in the nation. The BC Greens support a comprehensive anti-poverty strategy and have called on the government to create a poverty reduction plan. This would include things like low-cost housing, affordable housing, increased employment opportunities to equalize the opportunities for wellness for all British Columbians. Our goal is to nurture confident, resilient people and to ensure that the right protections are in place to maintain public safety and support those who are maybe going astray. When people feel safe and supported, they can live more joyful lives. So we believe that there should be fair and equal access to the justice system, and that how much money you have shouldn't limit your ability to have fair representation. Confident women are more likely to be happy, fulfilled, and productive than people who are stressed by environmental, economic, and social challenges. And that's the real point of government. Women who suffer from unemployment or underemployment, income insecurity, homelessness, or standard housing struggle throughout life. Early childhood, primary, and secondary education is a foundational investment in our community and our economic future and a key to a confident and productive society. So the BC Greens support initiatives that enable BC residents of all backgrounds to feel valued and to value each other in an inclusive society. We support full reconciliation with Indigenous peoples based on respect, inclusion, and mutual support. The BC Greens have called for the full implementation of all of the recommendations that came out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And we support education for all British Columbians so that we can really appreciate the significance of Indigenous cultures in our cultural landscape. The BC Greens support a school system that is integrated with community centers, recreation facilities, libraries, and schools. And we support affordable childcare and early learning programs for all children in BC. And having access to affordable childcare is not only the cost, but making sure the spaces are available. We're committed to doing that. Women's potential is affected by our access to education and training, our ability to feel entrepreneurial, the availability of stable and well-paying jobs, as well as our state of wellness and confidence. Income security is essential for women and their families to live comfortable lives. So the BC Greens support post-secondary education, including comprehensive trades education, as an investment in developing adaptive skills for a rapidly evolving world. We support a publicly funded education system that is accessible to all British Columbians, regardless of income and demographic. And we support lifelong learning, including access to adaptive skills training. So I keep bumping my belly on this podium, and it's making me lose my focus. I'm worried I'm not projecting enough. The BC Greens support a livable income for all British Columbians. Vancouver has the second highest rate of working poverty in the country. With the high cost of living and the low minimum wage and the growth of precarious employment, this has all contributed to rising levels of working poverty. And the BC Greens support the creation of a basic income for all British Columbians to ensure that we have income security, so that we're not relying on jumping through hoops to reach certain social support systems or having to trade the face-off between do I work do I have a job, or do I have to stay on social assistance so that I stay under the minimum? We have witnessed unprecedented increase in the cost of housing in this city. The BC Greens support the development of a comprehensive housing strategy. Comprehensive housing strategy to promote affordable housing for all British Columbians. We support strong protections for rental and lease tenants, and we believe that it's the government's responsibility to ensure all British Columbians have safe and stable housing and a place to call home. Our homes shouldn't really be a stock market for the wealthy. We are a party guided by our values of sustainability, respect for diversity, participatory democracy, ecological wisdom, social justice, and nonviolence. We believe British Columbians want to enjoy healthy, safe lives and a good standard of living, surrounded by the rich natural beauty of our province. We want to give our children and grandchildren the same opportunity, and we want a future that we can believe in. We want to sustain our environment, our economy, and our communities. So thank you again for the opportunity to hear your stories and to share my perspectives with you today. I hope that all the women here feel empowered to raise your hands and go vote on May 9th. It's through participation that we can create real change. And as women, we really are stronger together. So thank you.
Thank you. That was fabulous. All right. I am here to talk about why your vote counts. I'm just 3 minutes. So my name is Erin Arnold. I have the privilege of being on the Single Mother Alliance board and working collaboratively with many of the fabulous people here today and community groups who have courageously shared. I am touched by the stories and themes that have emerged. My role this afternoon is to encourage you to take the next step and vote in the upcoming provincial election on Tuesday, May 9th. Perhaps some of you may be curious, why does my vote count? Does it really matter? And it's hard not to be cynical. I can tell you without a doubt, there are many incidents where a seat has been won by a matter of a few votes, where fabulous candidate seats were occupied by others who were not champions for women's equality, poverty, housing, and reconciliation. There is an urgency here today for these very issues we have discussed. We need to come together and create momentum on our shared vision. I encourage you to find out who is running in your riding as a candidate, drop by their campaign office, or ask to meet with them about what matters to you. There are tremendous candidates across all party lines wanting to speak with you. I believe it is a privilege and a right. We are all here as members of society, and we have a right to vote. I feel it is my core belief that it's one of the only things that gives me and my child hope is the right to vote, to feel a part of democracy, that it's a key to be included in community and a sense for a better tomorrow. Your voice does matter. We need grassroots people, single moms, women of color, working people, people living with disabilities, and most of all you, to vote on May 9th for what you believe in. There is early voting taking place starting April 29th to May 6th, and I encourage you to all take advantage of this opportunity. There are shorter wait times and ensures your vote has been cast. In terms of your rights, voters are entitled to 4 consecutive hours free from work to vote on general voting day. Voting hours on general voting day are 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. If you have questions, I would be pleased to discuss how to get in touch with Elections BC, how to register to vote, or become involved in democracy. The Elections BC website is www.electionsbc.ca. Again, we have a booth at the back that has all the information you may want on how to register. I encourage you to take the next step, mark your ballot with your values, heart, and future. There is hope. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Erin. I just wanted to take a moment to thank you all for coming out today. The Single Mothers Alliance is an organization. We don't have any core funding or staff. We're an entirely volunteer-run and led organization, and 97% of our membership is women living on income assistance or precariously working or living far below the poverty line. So just want to sort of put that out there. We just do what we can when we can with the resources that we have. And so thank you all for coming today. I just really wanted to thank Joe Hall and his team for supporting us with this event. They allow us to have this venue. They allow a tiny little community organization like ours to actually put on an event like this. So the SFU Office of Community Engagement is truly a fantastic outfit. And I just wanted to give them a round of applause. Actually. I wanted to thank France Emmanuel and her husband for doing our beautiful poster, pro bono, of course, which was just absolutely wonderful. Kirsten, Tin, and Libby for helping us out today at the election of the voting table. Childminding Sabrina Moreau for being our Premier Mother's Helper over there. And Therese, our wonderful volunteer coordinator, who's this fantastic woman who came to the event that we had for the federal election. And she just dove in and helped with so many things. So thank you, and thank you, of course, to Debbie and Mai for coming out and just bearing your souls and your experiences for all of us here. It enriches all of us so much, and so thank you for doing that. And to our two speakers, and of course, our three candidates who took the time to come here today. There's a lot going on in Vancouver today. They're raising a reconciliation totem pole out at UBC, so thank you for taking the time to come to a very small community-based event, and to all of you, Trang and Elisa, and listening to us and hearing what we have to say about the CEDAW Convention and how we are really just activists and women who are carrying this work forward. So we really appreciate you coming out. And that's it. Thank you all. Okay.